And depending on your learning style, some of you might want to grab the Bible and turn to Matthew 4, 1 through 11, because I'm going to talk a lot about the Bible, because a different title of this sermon could be The Battle of the Bible between Satan and Jesus, which is also our ongoing battle. The story of the satanic temptations is actually rooted in the Old Testament, as most New Testament stories are. It's rooted in the story of the freed slaves who had suffered under the harsh rule of Pharaoh's empire. These slaves were immigrants who had left their homeland. They had flocked to the empire's capital, basically, seeking food and jobs and the possibility for a new beginning, a theme that is repeated throughout history over and over again. But within a few generations, the immigrant community had grown so large that Pharaoh began to worry about their own standard of life. And so what Pharaoh began to do, what the empires tend to do, is fearing the loss of their privileges, is they began to point the finger of accusation at the immigrants. The immigrants were responsible for everything bad that was happening. And so they brought out the whip and they enslaved them into a harsh and hopeless future. It was their cries. It was the cries of the immigrants, the sufferings of the immigrants that moved Yahweh to reveal power and presence. A deliverer, Moses, rose up and led the way into freedom from empire, freedom towards a new promised land of possibilities, overflowing with abundance. But as you know, freedom doesn't just happen. For 40 years, the liberated slaves wandered around the Arabian wilderness, and it was there that Israel as a nation was truly born. Indeed, Israel came to know itself as beloved, as chosen, as a special people of God. They were emancipated slaves, a bunch of nobodies. They were losers in the political game of life, and yet they came to know themselves as the embodied presence and power of God in history. The wilderness wanderings taught the freed slaves to trust Yahweh instead of Pharaoh. It was there, through 40 long years of wandering, of being tempted, of suffering, that formed them into the people of something completely new in human history. The satanic temptations occur after Jesus, freshly baptized by John in the Jordan River, felt compelled to venture off into the wilderness. Rising up out of the waters, Jesus hears a voice from Psalm 2, the scripture we read at the start of worship. That scripture, Psalm 2, was a royal psalm. It was chanted, it was sung every time Israel anointed a new king in its history. And Jesus, as he is lifted up out of the waters, hears the voice, "This is my Son, the beloved, in whom I am well pleased." And immediately, Jesus is sent into the wilderness on this 40-day vision quest to re-experience the history of Israel in his own life. Jesus was sent to explore his own mission and ministry and calling. What does it mean to be Son of God, earth's King, the beloved? After 40 days, Jesus was famished and weakened and vulnerable. And that's when the devil appears. And he prompts Jesus with a question that is a temptation for Jesus to doubt who he is and what his standing is before God. If you are the Son of God, if you are the beloved. Now, Satan within the scripture narrative is relatively minor character. He doesn't show up an awful lot. in the Hebrew scriptures, in the apostolic writings, but he's an intriguing character. He functions like a prosecuting attorney. He stands before God, accusing and condemning and slandering human beings who are the pinnacle of God's creativity. And here in the wilderness, Satan tries to plant these seeds of doubt within Jesus through a challenge. Turn these stones into bread. In other words, Jesus, Son of God, beloved, King, use your powers to serve yourself. Serve yourself, Son of God. Serve yourself, Earth King. Serve yourself, beloved. And who knows? After 40 days of fasting, maybe all the stones began to look a little like loaves of bread. And Jesus himself would go on in his ministry to do bread miracles, when he fed thousands from a few loaves and a couple of fish. And the people became so animated that they wanted to crown him king on the spot. But Jesus left the crowds, renounced the temptation to rule over others. Here in the wilderness, in the presence of the great deceiver, Jesus quotes from the Torah, "One does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." The battle of the Bible. This biblical text comes from a section of Scripture that warns Israel not to take God for granted. Jesus is saying to Satan that being a child of God, a beloved, means to trust God's provision within limits, within the limits of what that trust means. Jesus would not be a king like Pharaoh. He would not serve himself. Jesus' kingship would be different. His message would be about sharing a commonwealth, healing the body and the soul, disrupting generational poverty, disrupting aristocratic privilege. Jesus would speak of the Jubilee, the canceling, the forgiving of the debts of the poor, redistributing the wealth so that everyone had land, enough to survive and to thrive. That's the kind of king Jesus would be. And this is why, to bring it home to us here at Lake Washington, this is why for us providing safe parking is really just a first step, an entry level. What we really want to do is to help folks find a home, find a job, find a positive, safe, sane, sober community of friends, find a place to heal one's emotional, mental, and spiritual scars. What we really want to do is welcome the stranger, just as God has welcomed us. We want to represent God's commonwealth, not Pharaoh's fickleness. For us, we don't want to succumb to the temptation of doing good deeds that mask the callous indifference of the system we live under. Rather, we want to pry open the gates of hell and release folks from the grasp of Satan, from the grasp of poverty in all of its forms. We want to be like Jesus, serving others, bearing the cross as part of our character, helping others through the wilderness of homelessness into the promised land of housing, liberating others from Pharaoh's poverty into God's commonwealth of enough to survive, enough to thrive. Well, Satan wasn't getting anywhere with Jesus, and so he takes him up to the top of the temple, and he tries a different tactic. If you are the Son of God, the Earth King, the beloved, throw yourself off the wall of the temple. For Scripture says in Psalms, God will command the angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up so that you will not dash your foot against a stone. You're special, Jesus. It's a psalm of God's protection for those who trust in the Lord. Satan uses sacred word to tempt Jesus into turning his ministry into religious spectacle. Prove God's presence. Prove God's power through religious feats of miracle and magic, and certainly through making yourself a personality cult. Show off the supernatural. We know this temptation well through what media megabucks Christianity has done to the story of Jesus. Christianity has become a hype machine. Sometimes it's the outrageous claims of the prosperity preachers who basically say, give me your money, and you'll receive a blessing of even more money into your wallet, thus making God a magical transaction. Or the hyper healers who one by one get exposed as charlatans and cons, but only after enriching themselves while crushing the hopes of those who have no hope, making God a liar. There's more. Christianity, particularly media Christianity, has become a spectacle, a business, a carnival act, an emotional con, milking the desperation of the poor and the famished and the frightened and the vulnerable. Jesus rejected this satanic temptation. Drawing on the wisdom of Deuteronomy 6, a section of Scripture that introduces the great commandment, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your might." Jesus draws upon his own sufferings, his own experience of being weakened and being famished and being vulnerable, draws upon all of this to renounce Satan with the holy words, "Do not put the Lord your God to the test." It's in that same section of Scripture. Jesus reveals a fragile mystery in that God gives us everything we need, but not in advance. Only in the living does God give us what we need. And so Satan ups the ante yet again, returning to the baptismal voice which had said, "You are my son, the earth king, the beloved." Satan takes this scriptural story about the earth belonging to God, and he turns it on its head, proclaiming that he, Satan, owns the nations of the world. And to prove his point, the deceiver then shows Jesus all the kingdoms of the world, all the principalities and the powers of the world. And indeed, this is a real temptation for Jesus, because if he is who he thought he was, that voice at the baptismal covenant, "You are my son, the earth king, the beloved," if he is who he was, the very next verse in the Psalms says, "Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession." But it's here in the voice of Satan that Jesus is tempted to accept that all of the nations have already been given to Satan. And so Jesus is tempted to seize it back as the rightful heir, to seize back the power. Seizing political power is an ongoing temptation for the followers of Jesus. And one of the reasons that is because within Scripture itself, there are contradictory storylines, contradictory narratives, especially when it comes to political power. The primary narrative is right here in verse 2 or in Psalm 2. It's the narrative that God ordains powerful and even violent kings. "You shall break the nations with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel." Over and over in Scripture, particularly Israel's history, there is a dominant holy war narrative that portrays Yahweh as a mighty warrior and the king as Yahweh's tool. This holy war narrative even justifies ethnic cleansing, enslaving labor, treating women as property. This is what Satan is declaring is his own. All these I will give you. This kind of power I will give you. Now, in our time, within the church, Christian Zionists draw upon these holy war narratives to declare that Israel is a God-ordained power, which means practically that to oppose Israel is to oppose God. This is holy war rhetoric. The historical crusades of European history, lasting some 400 years, were a reflection of holy war Christianity. Our own nation's ethnic cleansing against indigenous peoples and our enslavement of Africans was all justified through holy war rhetoric. Indeed, one might even be able to say that both World War I and II were simply a continuation, a repetition of the 30-year wars of the 16th century that rocked Europe. Wars that were so gruesome that it led to a mass immigration movement into what is now the United States. And once here in the Promised Land, the immigrants created the first secular state in the history of civilization. That is the first state ever that refused to use God to justify its existence. Knowing the satanic temptation of fusing together God and government, our ancestors knew how to separate the two. But despite the revolutionary disestablishment clause that separated the religious and state power, what we are seeing today in our era is the emergence of a new church-state synthesis. There is a growing movement of Christian nationalism that assumes that Christians have a right to rule, are ordained to rule, and that the state, and particularly the office of the presidency, this goes beyond Trump, includes Trump, it goes beyond Trump, that the office itself is anointed by God for salvific purpose. Christian holy war rhetoric is being fused with the military, economic, and cultural policies of the Republican Party in alarming ways. And the specter of theocracy is haunting the halls of democracy, which most of us in America arrogantly assuming it can't happen here. All these I will give you. But it's not only here. Globally, this is the slide. Globally, Christianity has allied itself with what is known as illiberal society. Increasingly, we see the fusion of state and religious power, the coming together of both of them, being used to inhibit civil liberties and to scapegoat others. Bolsonaro and the evangelicals in Brazil, Orban and the reactionary Catholicism in Hungary, Putin and his alliance with Russian Orthodoxy, the Law and Justice Party in Poland and with hyper-conservative Catholicism, and recently democratically elected Evo Morales in Bolivia was overthrown in a coup that was a fusion of state and religious power. What these partnerships have in common is the creation of a closed society that hinders media, silences dissent, scapegoats immigrants or the indigenous, centralizes power in a hierarchical order with oligarchs. And when I say oligarchs, I'm not talking about wealthy people. I am talking about uber wealthy people. And it uses, and this is the key, and this is the point of talking about this in church, it uses Christian holy war rhetoric as justification and as a cultural bullwhip to enforce conformity and submission to the silencing of conscience, critical thinking, and the freedom of the individual. This is happening as we gather to worship. Jesus resisted Satan's offer of holy war power, even though he could point to sacred stories that justified God's violence and God's blessings of the pursuit of power. Jesus resisted with a different sacred narrative, a nonviolent, creation-centered, inclusive narrative rooted primarily in the prophets, but also evidenced as a minority voice throughout Scripture. Jesus, in his response to Satan, calls forth Deuteronomy 18, which is a section of Scripture that describes the very essence of God's desires. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and who loves the stranger, providing them with food and clothing. You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall reverence the Lord your God. God alone you shall worship. To God you shall hold fast, and by God's name you shall live. Jesus would be this kind of king, this form of beloved. His way of life, his kingdom, would consist of these types of action. The kingdom he would govern would become servants, providers, defenders of orphans and widows, the giver of empowerment and enfranchisement of all the powerless, statusless, and vulnerable peoples. Jesus would reflect this kind of God, this nonviolent God, who was with him in those 40 days of weakened vulnerability. Jesus rejected the holy war image of God. He rejected the dominant view, never used it in his ministry, never justified anything through his words and his teachings. He saw holy war narratives as satanic deception, a misreading of the sacred story, a temptation that led only to cultural and spiritual death. Today, the dominant expression of Christianity is far from the earth king who lives among the poor and the outcast. It is far from the one who rejects self-enhancement, religious spectacle, and political power. It is far from the one who embraces personal responsibility for the pain of others, complete solidarity with the no accounts, organizer of liberation for those enslaved to hierarchical power. This Son of God, this Earth King, this beloved, who is unlike all of our celebrities, all of our success models, all of our idols, all of those we tell our children to grow up and to become like, this positively maladjusted enigma, fully human, fully God, this Jesus, who calls and invites us to follow him into and through the wilderness, into and through the baptism, his life, his death, his resurrection, this Son of God, this Earth King, whose crown is a cross and whose victory can only be lived if it is to believe, to be believed. Dare we claim his name?